first question that came to my head after watching this. I saw it first at Cannes, completely cold, didn't know anything about it, didn't know it was your film. I was just struck by the soundscape. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Michael Levi and his role with the score, the integration of the score to the overall sound, and your direction for getting what we have here.
It's the sound particularly, to begin with.
To begin with the sound, yeah.
Thank you for coming, everybody, number one. Thank you for remaining as well. Well, I mean, the idea of the film was always that there would sort of be two films. There'd be the film you see and the film you hear. And so, right from the beginning, the proposition was that the sound would obviously give us a very clear sort of sense of what was happening, sort of perpetually over the wall in the camp. And a lot of those sounds were gathered, at least to begin with, as ideas from testimony, witness testimonies. There were no photographs obviously taken inside the camp at that stage, and a lot of our thoughts came from drawings actually that were done by prisoners who were during their imprisonment, who drew their witness evidence, visual evidence of the atrocities that were happening among them and around them. So those provided a lot of information sonically, of course, and also painters who had survived the war and had put brush to canvas in later life, and people like David Ollier, who painted his experience. And so they were our sort of eyewitness testimonies when it came to understanding what sort of sounds would be there. Sorry, long-winded way, but and then our sound designer Johnny Byrne and his team would then go about doing field recordings, often where no sounds existed. For instance, they'd be in they'd go to Germany, for instance, Berlin at night. And they'd wait for an argument to happen, and they'd put themselves somewhere where they could record it. And then we would just, things like that, we would just begin to sort of catalogue all of those sounds and then construct the soundtrack from real sound. And then Mika's job was to compose the music for the film, of course. But we all sort of share a space together when we're working together. So it's all in flux all the time. It's never like, I'll finish shooting, then I'll finish cutting, then I'll finish sound, then I'll start the music, then I'll do the visual effects. It's sort of all at once. And so Mika, myself, Paul Watts, the editor, and Johnny Byrne, the sound designer, are all essentially in the same space for, Mika was with us for about 10 months, Paul and I were in there for over a year. One aspect of the filmmaking informs the other. So music might change the edit might change the sound may change the visual effects, and so on. So we're all sort of doing it in flux and simultaneously, really.
I mean, it feels like there was an iterative process to have something so concise. So the characters of Rudolph and Hedwig. So how did you go about constructing the details? I imagine Rudolph, there's more about him, but things like Hedwig's weird gait, is that based on reality, or is that how much of it is your interpretation based on how much information you have about both the parents and the kids, actually?
Well, a lot of the research process in really trying to get a sense of the private lives of these people really came from witness testimonies that are held by the Auschwitz State Museum Archive. And we had a couple of researchers as part of our process of research. We had two researchers who were working in those archives for about 3 or 4 months, going through volumes of testimony, and their brief, or our brief to them, was to sort of excavate any mention of him or his wife or their family or anything that might have happened, big or small. And some of those girls, those local Polish girls who worked in their house and in other houses of the SS locally, did survive the war. And they, obviously they were right, they would give testimony to what their experiences were. And they overheard some things sometimes. And critically, actually, one of the pieces of information that we found from that research was was something that became a sort of fulcrum of the whole story, if there is one, obviously, which is the transfer. And that came from a gardener who worked in the house who survived the war, who overheard an argument between him and his wife when he told her about the transfer, and she refused to leave and hit the roof, you know. So that when I read that, I thought, okay, that's the center of this, and that's when we set it. So a lot of that stuff informed what you see.
And then I understand your first visit, physical visit to Auschwitz, was something of a pivotal moment where there was a kernel of a story, but what was it about visiting that kind of gelled and made everything come together for you?
These things, unfortunately, don't ever happen in one sort of epiphanal moment. They sort of you gather things, or I do anyway. You gather a bit by bit and a sort of understanding of something, and you just sort of begin to walk that road and find out where it takes you. But I do remember a lot about it, of course. But one thing in terms of the film was the proximity of the house that they lived in and the camps that they exterminated people in. So. And that proximity is exactly accurate to what you see in the film, which is, of course, jaw-dropping in its proximity. But it's true, you know. That's how they lived. Where one side of their garden was the prison wall, and the other side, of course, was the camp. So that wall, it sort of, in some ways, became the sort of a literal, physical manifestation of how we compartmentalize.
And apart from the modern sequence from modern times, when we go back to Auschwitz, how much of the film utilized the actual structures of Auschwitz today? Because everything was sparkling new.
Well, it's a good question. We obviously, when you revisit a historic location like that, it's 80 years, 85 years later, and it's obviously it's got the patina of that time past, and it sort of was in a place where it was just beyond. The aim of the film was to clearly kind of try and tell it as much in the present tense as possible, and so everything had to serve that idea of it being now. And at that point, it was only 4 or 5 years old. So the house you see is a reconstruction of a derelict house that was about 60 meters from the real Hoss house, which is inhabited by a local Polish family who lived there. And of course, we couldn't just take over that house and film in that much as I originally wanted to. But this other house we then remade and made the entire garden and everything you see there. So forgive me, I've lost the train of your question. Sorry.
Well, it's how you can manage to shoot in derelict facilities and portray them as new. So I assume it's CGI to a certain extent.
Oh yeah. Sorry. So the camp itself, by being the age it is now, of course, it's and the trees, the saplings that were planted by prisoners on the other side of the wall, are now 80 foot tall. So we had to start again with the camp. So everything that you see up to and including the wall. The house, the garden, everything was built by Chris Oddy, our production designer, and his team. And everything over the wall is a sort of, using visual effects and photogrammetry and so on, is a reconstruction, a digital reconstruction of the camp. But the distances from, for instance, the house to the Commandant building, where he has his office, and the chimney down the end of the garden are accurate to real life.
I think the village girl, I don't know her name. It took me a little bit to understand what was going on, because we switched to a very different style of shooting. It's a heat camera, military grade heat sensing camera. Can you talk about your decision to utilize that technology and it was a challenging?
It was all challenging, yeah, but it was all to serve this idea of 21st century lens that we'd be looking at it not as a piece of history, but somehow we'd open a door on something that was ongoing. So it wasn't, and I certainly didn't want to film it conventionally. I couldn't see a way of filming it conventionally. I didn't want to get caught up in the sort of screen psychologies of actors, which is what we are actually what we would be looking at. So I wanted to sort of stay away so that we could put ourselves, see ourselves in them, project ourselves onto them as a sort of thing. So we had this sort of critical distance from them, and that creates that sort of real-time experience, I think. Again, I'm really sorry, I've forgotten the other part.
I shouldn't do so many two-part questions.
No, you're doing great. I'm just jet lag.
Well, it's that's the idea, the philosophical idea behind, but then the challenges of shooting with a non-cinematic camera.
That is yeah. Which was that we so we didn't use any film lights at all. So everything had to serve that idea of the reality that we were trying to recreate. And we shot with natural light or practical lights, table lamps and ceiling lights and so on. There's no film lights in the film. There's one, in fact, where the mother-in-law is looking out the window. But other than that, there are no film lights used at all. So when it came to how do I shoot this local Polish girl leaving fruit for these prisoners in these sort of sites at night where they would be working during the day, I couldn't suddenly introduce, lighting. So it really comes down to what's the right tool for that, and I just, well, how do I see what I can't see with my eyes? How are we going to see that? So you just sort of let me just start thinking about thermal imaging, and then we investigate that and then develop that and shoot it.
It's a granular question, but the apples seemed hotter than I would have expected them to be. Did you warm the apples, or was that?
Occasionally we did, yeah. Occasionally we did warm things up for them to have more presence. But those cameras are really extraordinary because they film the entire spectrum of heat, from white being the hottest and black being the coldest, and the whole grayscale between. So when you film, you're looking at something much cruder, like a sort of high contrast image, like a white, glowing heat human being, and everything else completely black. But as you sort of go into sort of hack the image, within it, there's this extraordinary grayscale of variation, and then so Gareth, my colleague who graded the film, would be spending, I think he spent about 3 or 4 weeks grading all of those details out of that footage.
And another aspect of that character, who's really a phenomenal presence in the film, but the piece of music that she finds, the Sunbeams, Robert Wolfe, Joseph Wolfe's Sunbeams. Can you talk about how you chose that piece, and is that his voice in the film?
It is, yeah. So I'll tell you, the girl in the film is based on a woman I met, a 90-year-old woman who lived. She's since passed away, but she lived in that house that we filmed in, which was her grandfather built that house. It's about 2 kilometers from Auschwitz, and she basically told me her story, which was that she was a 14-year-old girl at the time, and she joined the Polish resistance, and a lot of children did at the time, and their job were, dangerous errands, really, running information back and forth, but for her it was about leaving food. So that's what she did. So the woman you see, the girl you see in the film, is based on that. Her name was Alexandra, and in fact everything in that house and that attic remained, and in fact the dress the girl wears was her dress, the bike she rides was her bike, the backpack she uses was her backpack. So it's very realistic again to what happened there, and the music she finds was it wasn't a common thing, but there were stories about people who they would leave things that were precious to them in the hope that they'd be found at some point, or letters and so on, and there of course were people in those camps who came from all walks of life, and there were composers, and this one gentleman called Joseph Wolfe happened to survive the war and record after the war the piece of music wrote while he was incarcerated. So she finds that in a tin while she's planting pears, and plays it in her flat, in her apartment, in the morning. And it's a song called Sunbeams, and it's yes, he recorded it in the 1950s after the war. But so it's it's a melody that he would have come from himself, no doubt, in those conditions.
I'm going to go back to the actors, and Christian's performance. It's fascinating to me because there's just a dead-eyed coldness to him the entire way through this film, and you look at pictures of him, and he's quite a handsome man, and he seems to be an expressive, emotive guy. But how do you direct someone to suck the life out of your being for a role like this? It seems like a strange direction.
Well, I mean, it's he understood that there was something actually very undynamic about this man who he was portraying, and it's certainly not a biographical recreation or anything in it directly, but it was about credit. It was about somebody who's clearly quite opaque. They're not forthcoming emotionally. How could they be? But everything that we heard of, everything that we read about the real Rudolf Haas pointed towards a very quiet, Primo Levi called him a quiet fool. I mean, there was a sort of feeling that he was a very undynamic, he could have been a grocery clerk, in another life, and he was just that. He was just a normal guy, and step by step, of course, it's like so many, he became a mass murderer. But and Christian, there's something extremely avuncular, but amiable about Christian. Technically, he's a really consummate actor. He's really great, but there's something about that kind of affability in him that sort of that I thought felt right to challenge, to be challenged by, rather than someone fake, falsely villainous who you'd immediately think, well, that's not, I could be that. Rather, it's really the whole point of the film is to sort of try and see the similarities between ourselves and the perpetrators, and not have the comfort of seeing ourselves and our similarities in the victims. His last scene in the film is retching, but potentially coming to grips with some element of the truth. And I understand that there might be some influence there from the Josh Oppenheimer movie, The Act of Killing. And can you talk about that and how that scene came to be and how the film influenced that? Well, the scene starts like, for me that scene began with me trying to understand trying to picture him, I think, at the end of his life, or the worthlessness of a particular life, and I remember doing a sketch of a pair of shoes and a pile of vomit. At the base of a pile of vomit were a pair of shoes, and I thought, well, that's him. And so I always had that in mind, that would be rendered. I didn't know how yet, but and then and of course these characters have no arc. There's no conscience. There's no salvation. There's no redemption. There's nothing. They're flat lines. So, but I wanted evidence of the body rejecting the man somehow. The body, the fact that how we delude ourselves with our minds. Our bodies tell the truth. So there's something in the truthfulness of that rejection and that the horror, the kind of inner horror that's made sense to me. To your question, I saw The Act of Killing during this process of making this, writing the script and researching and so on. And so, of course, then I saw the real evidence of that, which of course was extraordinary to see, having thought that might be how I was going to end the film. So, and I asked Christian to vomit in the scene. We tried to plan for him to vomit and take something that would make him vomit.
I was going to ask another granular question about the logistics there.
But he didn't want to do that. So, fair enough. But he, but he didn't want to do that. So he just sort of rejected that idea. I understand why. He just was frightened of it, and so then I had to do it. I had to then fake it. I'm pretty bad at asking actors to fake things physically like that. It's quite a difficult thing to fake. And so we looked at that scene together, and because I could obviously trust that scene as something that was completely real, and then Christian sort of took that inside himself and then essentially performed it.
I read that Sandra had a personal vow to never play a Nazi. How did you get her to change her mind?
Well, I mean, it was a long conversation, went on for months, you know. And actually, in the end, my wife, I remember calling my wife and saying, I was already prepping, we were already doing location records, and she said, finally, we had our final conversation. She said she was going to think hard about it the weekend. She had it, and my wife said, what do you know, I said, I don't know what else to say to her, and she said, why don't you just say that? So I texted Sandra, what my wife said, and Sandra said, okay, I'm in, and I thought, I can't tell you what the text was, but it's, but well, no, so that was the end of, that was a great relief, but it was, so Sandra's reluctance to play, to portray Hedwig Hoss is again, really understandable. She, you know, she didn't want to cosplay that sort of thing. It's dangerous. If you do it well, you empower those people, and if you don't, then it's worthless for other reasons. So Sandra and I had a conversation early on, and I think my doubts in the whole project anyway were shared by her. You know, I wasn't coming with any certainty about this whatsoever. You know, it was an experiment. So I was hopeful that things would work and that I was doing the right thing, and that I would therefore, the people, like my collaborators, you know, I'd be taking them down a road that was a good one. But you can't be sure when you start. And Sandra just didn't want to empower these people, but of course neither did I. And so Hannah Arendt, if people have heard of Hannah Arendt, some have, you know, Hannah Arendt, you know, famously wrote about the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in the 1960s. And she was talking about this mindset, and one of the things I remember she wrote about was how they were non-thinking. It was one of the terms she used. And in order to think as a human, as us, you know, we have to stop first. We have to stop to think. And so, you know, Sandra approached it from that idea of not stopping, because if she doesn't stop, then she's not thinking. And if you don't want her to be thinking, because you don't want reflection. You don't want reflection that could lead to conscience or something like that, which, of course, there was no evidence that they had. And so she busies herself, you know, with activities, you know, big and small, one after the other. It's just this sort of, she's in this, she's just constantly occupied, and that's how she did it. And physically, how she changed her physicality is brilliant. But I mean, that's a measure of her quality.
I mean, both leads are fantastic. So, you refer to the set, the filming locations, as the arena. What do you mean by that? What is the intention there?
Well, I wanted to take the crew and I wanted to take everything out of the environment, so that there was no, so that the people, the actors, would have no, there would be no, nothing about work. Basically, Chris built the set, the house and the garden in 360 degrees, which meant that everywhere they would, if you were to stand anywhere in that location, that set, you would believe everything you saw. You'd be walking into 1943. And I didn't want then I wanted the cameras to somehow be invisible, and for the crew not to be anywhere near the filming, so that it was like stepping onto a stage. Although even in a stage, there's at least on one side there's going to be an audience, and there was no audience. You know, there was so the cameras were rigged in the house. We used 10 often for scenes, and so that I could capture everything simultaneously. And so we used to call it like Big Brother in the Nazi house. You know, there was that sort of feeling of like surveillance, really, of dropping in on nothing dramatic at all, just somebody brushing their teeth or pouring a cup of coffee or whatever. But to capture everything at once in real time was I think where the word arena came from. It's just, that's what it felt like. Like the whole house was rigged with cameras, all the wires came out of the roof and across the telephone pole down to the other side of the wall where we were in a container with monitors and microphones and by translator and DIT and everything else. But for the actors, there was nothing, they believed who they were. The kids, I didn't want to direct the kids, and get into that. I just wanted them to exist in that space. It was really just about being, not acting.
How do you stop? How do you say cut? Is there a voice of God, or is it just like runs its course?
Good question. Will you run out of film? Or tape even. I mean, when I used to shoot on film, I love film, of course, but the downside of shooting on film is that it runs out, 10 minutes at the maximum, you're done. So as soon as something's getting good, you haven't got any film left to record it. And I'm at that point now with these digital cards that are like 45 minutes long, and they never feel long enough when you're filming like that. You're just capturing it, you're gathering, I like to feel like I'm gathering what's happening, and I work it all out later.
So this question, feel free to veto it if it just doesn't resonate for you, but I see this film as something of a call to action, even, if you will. It's putting in the lens of where we are today with the rise of evil on so many fronts. What is success for you? What do you want to see happen in the wake of this film?
Well, I think that what the film is, I think that the impulse behind the film is, of course, the fact that the atrocity that is represented here is not unique, and so we have, as human beings, a capacity for violence in us, and I hope that we will be able to evolve out of it at some point as a species, and I do wonder and think how remarkable what we could achieve as a species if we could do so. But that's that's idealistic, of course, but that is the impulse. It's like if it's to recognise that the things we disassociate from, selective empathy and walls, the abominations that are taking place in the world today, and have done through history, are unacceptable.
So I have one last question for you, slightly lighter than where we've been, but if, say, the Jonathan Glazer of the mid-1990s, the music video creating Jonathan Glazer, came here and was up on stage, how different, through your journey of creating for these years, how different are you from the very beginning?
I don't know how. Of course, like anyone, we live our lives and things happen to you and you experience things and you change because of them. I try and do everything I do as well as I can do it. So that's not different.
Fair enough. It's probably not a great question. Now this is more of a request for everybody here, and also we're simulcasting to Alamo Drafthouse theaters all over the country right now. This is, I will say it, is a beautiful movie that people need to see. Our cinemas were built to show this type of entertainment. Jesus. Beauty. It is a foreign language film. It is a heavy subject, but it demands to be seen. And so I want to ask you to be part of the megaphone, if you appreciated the experience tonight, you stand around the water cooler, tell your friends, tell your enemies, whatever, but tell people to get out and see this and support this film. I think it's important, and I think everybody will appreciate your advocacy, especially me. And thank you very much for coming and being with us this evening, and thank you for dedicating a significant portion of your life to creating such a wonderful film.